The bus was crowded, as usual during the late afternoon rush in Birmingham, Alabama. Every seat was occupied, and the aisles were packed with passengers holding onto metal poles, balancing with the motion of the bus. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and the low murmur of conversations, blending into the usual hum of the commute. Among the passengers sat a young man, likely in his early 20s. He had a sharp jawline and a certain arrogance that was evident in the way he spoke. His voice broke the monotony of the bus as he scolded his mother. "Why do you always forget things, Mom? This is embarrassing," he said, his tone harsh as he waved his hands in exasperation. Next to him, his elderly mother, her silvery hair soft and her eyes weary, fiddled nervously with her purse. She avoided the eyes of the other passengers, her gaze falling to the floor. "I'm sorry, Nathan," she said quietly, her voice barely rising above a whisper. "I thought I packed it." Nathan let out a frustrated sigh, clearly agitated. "You always do this. No wonder Dad left you." The murmurs of disapproval spread among the passengers. Some glanced over with uncomfortable expressions, but no one spoke up. Not yet. At the back of the bus, sitting silently, was a tall black man in military uniform. His name tag read Gaines, though no one paid much attention to it. His presence was commanding, his military medals shining faintly, but he remained still, his gaze fixed on the unfolding scene without a hint of anger, just quiet observation. Nathan continued his tirade, louder now, his words filled with contempt. The mother, her hands trembling, adjusted her glasses, a faint flush of embarrassment creeping across her face. "I don't know why you can't ever do anything right," Nathan spat. "You're so useless." His voice cracked, and the words hung heavy in the air. The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one intervened. Some pretended to look at their phones, subtly recording the scene. Others shifted nervously in their seats. Gaines watched it all in silence, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. His posture remained calm, but there was an undeniable sense of tension building around him. Nathan's voice grew louder, more hostile. "This is why Dad left. You've always been a mess." The elderly woman flinched at his words, a tear slipping down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, hoping no one had noticed, but it was impossible to miss. The discomfort among the passengers was palpable. A teenager, holding her phone at a subtle angle, whispered to her friend, "This is going to blow up online." Her friend just shook her head, muttering, "It's just sad." Gaines shifted in his seat, his eyes locked on Nathan, his expression unreadable but intense. As Nathan continued to berate his mother, the bus seemed to shrink with the rising tension. Everyone was waiting for someone to step in to break the silence, but no one did, until Gaines stood up. His movements were deliberate, measured, and as he stood, his presence seemed to take over the entire bus. He was tall, his uniform immaculate, and his calm authority commanded attention. As he made his way down the aisle, the quiet buzz of the bus fell away, leaving only the sound of the engine humming in the background. When he reached Nathan, the younger man seemed to shrink into his seat, his earlier bravado fading in the face of Gaines's steady gaze. The passengers were watching, holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Gaines stopped a few feet from Nathan. His shadow loomed over him, and for a moment he said nothing. He turned his gaze to the elderly woman, her tear-streaked face still trying to hold back her emotions. He sighed deeply, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "I wasn't going to say anything," Gaines began, his tone steady but filled with quiet authority. "But watching this, I can't just sit back and do nothing." Nathan shot back, defiant. "What are you going to do? Lecture me now." But Gaines ignored the challenge. His focus was entirely on the mother, and he crouched down to meet her eye level. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice carrying a quiet respect, "you deserve respect, especially from your own son." Then turning back to Nathan, he straightened up, his voice growing firm. "You remind me of someone I once knew, someone who thought they had all the time in the world to apologize." Nathan frowned in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Gaines's expression grew more serious. "I served in the military for years. Seen things most people can't even imagine, but nothing haunts me more than the day I buried my mother. The entire bus seemed to hold its breath. The hum of the engine faded away and a deep silence filled the air. I was young, full of myself. Gaines continued, his voice quieter now, laced with pain. I'd brush her off when she called me, telling her I was too busy to talk. I'll call you later, I'd say, but later never came. Then one day, I got the call. She was gone. Nathan's defiance faltered. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the anger in his eyes giving way to something deeper, something unsettling. Gaines leaned in slightly, his voice dropping even lower. Do you know what it feels like to stand over a casket and wish for just one more chance to say, I'm sorry, or I love you? But you can't because it's too late. The tension in the bus was suffocating. The elderly woman wiped her face with trembling hands, her lips pressed tight, holding back the sobs that threatened to break free. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, nothing else mattered. Gaines leaned forward slightly, his voice sharpening as he addressed Nathan. Don't become the kind of man who waits until it's too late, he said, his words carrying a weight that seemed to silence the entire bus. That's a regret you'll have to live with forever. Nathan's face turned crimson. He opened his mouth as if to reply, but no words came out. His hands clenched the fabric of his jeans, and his head dropped lower. The bus seemed to freeze, as if no one dared to break the moment. Then, breaking the silence, Nathan spoke, and it was something no one had expected. He sat frozen for a few moments, his knuckles white as he held onto his jeans. The defiance he'd shown earlier was gone, replaced by a stillness that seemed fragile. Slowly he lifted his head, meeting Gaines's gaze. The defiance had drained from his face, leaving vulnerability in its place. His voice cracked as he spoke. I didn't mean to hurt her, he stammered, swallowing hard. The words hung in the air, shaky and fragile. His mother's eyes widened and her lips parted in surprise, but she remained silent. Her silence was filled with so much emotion it was almost tangible. Gaines didn't move, his gaze steady and unwavering. Say it, he urged softly but firmly. Say what you're afraid to say. Nathan's jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked like he might lash out again. But then his shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him. He turned to his mother, his hands shaking as he reached for her arm. She flinched, but didn't pull away. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I've been so angry and I took it out on you. You didn't deserve that. Tears streamed down his mother's face as she looked at him, her expression softening. Oh, Nathan, she said, her voice breaking. You're my son. I've always forgiven you, but hearing you say this, it means so much. The bus seemed to breathe collectively, the tension lifting slightly. Passengers exchanged glances, some with tears welling up in their eyes. The teenager who had been recording lowered her phone, her earlier smirk replaced with a softer expression. Nathan wasn't finished. He turned back to Gaines, his voice steadier now. Thank you, he said, his words sincere. I didn't realize how much I was taking her for granted. Hearing your story, it hit me. Gaines nodded, his expression softening. It's not easy to admit when you're wrong, he said, but what matters is what you do next. Words are just the beginning. Nathan looked down, a shadow of shame still on his face. I want to do better, he said quietly. For her. The elderly woman placed her hand gently over his, her fingers trembling but warm. We'll figure it out, she said, her voice filled with both hope and love. Gaines took a step back, his imposing presence retreating slightly as the moment shifted. He glanced around the bus, meeting the eyes of a few passengers who silently nodded in respect. But just as the atmosphere started to lighten, something unexpected happened. As the bus pulled up to a red light, a voice from the back startled everyone. It was an elderly man sitting near the emergency exit, someone who had gone unnoticed until now. He leaned forward, his voice gravelly but strong enough to carry. Young man, he called out to Nathan, you've taken the first step. Don't stop now. All eyes turned to the older gentleman. His face, weathered by years of hard-earned wisdom, looked up from beneath his flat cap. "I lost my son a few years ago," he continued, his tone firm but not unkind. "We hadn't spoken in over a decade. Do you know what I'd give for just 5 minutes to tell him how much I loved him? Don't waste the time you've got." Nathan's face turned a deeper shade of red as tears welled up in his eyes, unbidden. He glanced at his mother, her hand still resting gently on his. For the first time in ages, there was no judgment in her gaze, only understanding. Nathan looked around the bus, realizing how many strangers had witnessed his shame and his apology. He stood abruptly, taking his mother's hand. "Come on, Mom," he said, his voice trembling but steady. "Let's get off here. I want to talk. Really talk." The passengers parted to let them through, offering soft smiles and nods of encouragement as they exited the bus. A quiet murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Gaines watched them leave, his expression unreadable. But as the doors closed behind them, a small, satisfied smile crept onto his face. He returned to his seat, leaning back with a sense of quiet accomplishment. A few rows ahead, the teenager who had been recording hesitated before stopping the video and deleting it. "Not everything needs to go online," she muttered to her friend, who nodded in agreement. The bus continued its journey, but the atmosphere had shifted. The passengers weren't just staring out the windows or scrolling through their phones anymore. They were reflecting on family, forgiveness, and the fleeting nature of time. As the bus neared Gaines's stop, the man seated next to him spoke up, his voice low. "That was something back there," he said. "The way you handled that, it made me think. I haven't called my mom in weeks. I think I'll do that tonight." Gaines smiled faintly, standing as the bus came to a stop. "You should," he said, his voice warm. "One call can make all the difference." As he stepped off the bus and into the afternoon sunlight, the passengers watched him go. His quiet strength had left an impression they wouldn't soon forget. This story reminds us that time with our loved ones is precious. The words we speak, whether kind or cruel, carry weight and shape the bonds we share. Respect, humility, and gratitude are lessons worth learning. Before it's too late, if this story moved you, take a moment today to reach out to someone you love, say the words you've been meaning to say. And if you want more stories that inspire and make you think, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Let's spread kindness together.